The first thing that struck my tent was not a branch. It was so heavy that the stakes ripped from the ground, and the tarp pressed flat against my face. I rolled out of my sleeping bag, grabbed the flashlight, and saw, just in time, a black furred hand clamping around the tent frame. Outside, something was breathing in rough, hot bursts. I crawled toward the knife, but the Bigfoot yanked hard, dragging the entire tent through the mud. Then it roared right beside my ear. "Hello, I'm Victor, and you're back with Bigfoot Sasquatch Story." Today's story takes us to the Hoh Rainforest in Washington state, where an ordinary camping trip became a confrontation with a creature science still cannot explain. This story was collected and compiled by our editorial team from forums, blogs, witness accounts, local records, and Bigfoot research communities. We cannot verify whether this was a real incident, a memory reshaped by time, or a modern legend, so listen with an open mind. Before we begin, comment, believe, if you think the deep woods still hide creatures unknown to us. Ethan Cole left Tacoma on a Friday morning in late October, while the western sky was still covered by low clouds, and the road remained streaked with water from the rain the night before. He placed Daniel's old backpack on the passenger seat, pulled the seatbelt across it, out of a habit he could not explain, then started the Subaru that had already passed 100,000 miles. To his co-workers at the emergency center, Ethan had only said he needed a few days outside to breathe. But this trip was really a promise delayed for 3 years. Before Daniel died in a highway accident, the two brothers had planned to camp in Alder Creek Valley, a place Daniel believed still had forests old and vast enough to make human beings feel small. Rachel called just as Ethan left the city. She asked if he had packed the new satellite locator. Then she went silent for a few seconds when she heard him mention Daniel's old emergency pager. Rachel said, heavy rain was in the forecast, many forest roads were blocked by fallen trees, and the western Olympic Peninsula had almost no signal. Ethan answered that he had checked the maps, packed medical gear, and would only be gone 3 days. The way he said it made the answer sound less like reassurance and more like a locked decision. Rachel asked him to turn back and get the new device. But Ethan looked at the backpack beside him, tightened his grip on the steering wheel, and said he did not want to delay another year. Near noon, he stopped at a small gas station outside Forks to buy batteries, water, and a roll of paracord. The elderly man behind the counter looked at the paper map Ethan had opened and asked which area he was heading into. When he heard Alder Creek and Logging Road 29, the man's hand stopped wiping the counter. He said that stretch had been partly closed because of slides, but a few hunters still snuck in. They had heard steady knocks in the middle of the night and found deer carcasses untouched, except for the missing liver. Ethan said black bears or cougars could explain that. The old man did not argue. He marked an abandoned ranger station on the map, then looked straight at Ethan and said that if the forest suddenly went silent, he should not try to prove he was brave. When Ethan drove away from the gas station, he saw a gray pickup parked on the shoulder. 3 men in hunting clothes stood beside it, and one of them watched him until the road disappeared behind the trees. That stare stayed with Ethan all the way. Logging Road 29 quickly changed from cracked pavement into a narrow strip of gravel, rough with stones and filled with brown puddles. Ethan had to keep slowing because branches scraped along both sides of the car, and thin mist clung low between the fir trunks, making the road ahead appear and disappear. He stopped twice to drag large branches away from the tires, then stopped again when he reached a metal gate across the road. The road closed sign lay face down in the mud. The lock had been cleanly cut, and fresh tire tracks still crossed the ground. Ethan stood there for a while, remembering the man at the gas station. But the tire marks made him believe forestry workers or local hunters still used the route. He drove on, slower than before, with the window cracked, so he could hear the engine and the sounds around him. Near 4 in the afternoon, a fallen tree blocked the entire road, its roots torn from the bank in a wall of mud and stone. Ethan parked close to the shoulder, hid the spare key beneath the trunk mat, and shouldered Daniel's backpack. He walked almost 3 miles before finding a flat patch beside Alder Creek, where water moved over moss-covered stones in a steady sound strong enough to hide many smaller noises in the forest. There was no campsite marker, but an old fire ring, fresh ash, and 2 bright cuts on a cedar trunk showed that someone had recently stayed there. While setting up the tent, Ethan saw a food can flattened against a tree trunk, wedged higher than he could reach. The metal had no teeth marks and had not been torn open like something mauled by bear claws. It had been crushed inward, as if a very large hand had squeezed it hard, then pressed it into the bark. Ethan took several photos, then circled the camp looking for tracks. He found only wide patches of moss flattened into broad shapes, not clear enough to identify. Near the fire ring, 3 long branches lay parallel to one another, all their pointed tips facing north. Ethan picked them up, broke them into smaller pieces, and added them to the fire because the wood inside was still dry. As darkness settled, he hung his food bag from a high branch, tied a thread with small bells around the camp, then went down to the creek for water. From the far side of the valley, 2 engine sounds rose for several minutes before stopping abruptly. Ethan called loudly to announce his presence, but the forest gave back only the sound of water. When he returned, the 3 branches were back in their original place beside the fire ring, straight and pointing north again, as if someone had quietly repaired a message Ethan had accidentally broken. After full dark, rain began falling steadily through the canopy, creating a thick layer of sound that made it hard for Ethan to tell water from movement in the woods. He sat beside the small stove, hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, and opened Daniel's final voice recording on his phone. His brother's voice came through with a faint crackle, talking about a coastal road and promising that the trip to Alder Creek would happen the following fall. Ethan was about to turn it off when a dry knock sounded from across the creek. He raised his head and waited a few seconds, telling himself a branch had cracked. 30 seconds later, the sound repeated twice, even and clear enough that he set the cup down. The next sequence came in 3 knocks, each spaced almost perfectly. Ethan picked up the axe handle, stepped to the nearest tree, and knocked twice too. Test the sound. The forest stayed silent for almost a minute. Then 2 knocks answered from deeper in the dark, so powerful that a flock of sleeping birds burst out of the treetops all at once. Ethan lowered the axe handle. Curiosity immediately gave way to caution. He checked the bell line around camp and found that one section had been removed from the tree. The knot was still intact, as if someone had lifted the entire loop over a low branch and set it on the ground. Ethan crouched to study the drops of water on the thread and noticed one side of the moved section was still dry, as if a hand had shielded it from rain while lifting it. A strong odor began moving into the camp, a mix of wet fur, sour earth, and old animal musk. Ethan swept the flashlight across every trunk, but the beam only struck rain, moss, and deep pockets of darkness between cedars. He called out, saying he did not want trouble and would leave in the morning. No human voice answered. Ethan gathered his knife, phone, and bear spray into the tent, then turned on the camera to record. The screen showed only white streaks of rain, but the microphone captured slow, heavy breathing not far away, clearer than before. When he bent down to secure the knife in the side pocket, a small stone landed right in front of his boot. Its surface was completely dry, though the ground around it was soaked. Ethan looked toward the direction it had come from and saw a figure taller than any grown man slip behind a tree. At that exact moment, the phone inside the tent began replaying Daniel's voice by itself. A deep groan rose right behind Ethan's back. Ethan spun so fast his heel slipped in the mud beside the tent. The flashlight beam swept across the space behind him but caught only rain-darkened trunks. The groan had vanished. In its place were heavy footsteps moving around the camp, in a slow, steady, deliberate rhythm. Ethan backed into the tent, zipped it shut, and turned off the light, hoping the darkness would make whatever stood outside lose interest. He placed the bear spray beside his knee, held the knife in his right hand, and tried to count each breath so his mind would not collapse into panic. The footsteps stopped at the stove, then shifted to the food bag, the fire ring, and the place where the 3 branches had been arranged. A huge hand pressed against the side of the tent, pushing the fabric inward in 5 long lines, right in front of Ethan's face. He raised the bear spray, then realized the wind was driving the rain straight toward him. If he sprayed now, it might blind him before it reached whatever was outside. The next blow came down on top of the tent, hard enough to rip 2 stakes from the ground. The frame tilted sideways, rolling Ethan, the sleeping bag, and his gear into a tangled mass. The creature grabbed the frame and dragged the whole tent almost 2 meters through the mud. Ethan used the knife to cut a slit in the side wall, planted his elbow into the ground, and crawled out. When he lifted his head, the flashlight caught a figure standing less than 4 meters away. The creature was more than 7 feet tall, with shoulders almost as wide as a car door and long arms hanging low beside its body. Its black-brown fur was soaked with rain. On its right shoulder, a stripe of silver fur ran down its back. Its face projected forward, its eyes dark but focused, and its breath came out in thick, rough bursts. It stared at Ethan for a few seconds, then turned its head north, slammed one hand onto the ground, and made a short sound. Ethan interpreted the movement as a posture before a charge. He pulled the trigger on the bear spray. The cloud only brushed the edge of the creature's face because the wind shifted. It snapped its head back, roared, and came at him in 2 long strides. One hand seized the tent frame and hurled the entire thing aside. Ethan fell backward into the mud as he tried to retreat. The creature grabbed the strap of Daniel's backpack and dragged him several feet north before a metallic sound cracked from far away. A suppressed gunshot snapped through the rain. The bullet struck a tree beside the creature's shoulder. It released Ethan, struck the ground hard, and vanished between the cedars. 2 more small gunshots followed in the rain. Ethan lay still, one hand clenched in mud, and understood that the creature that had attacked him might not be the most dangerous thing in this forest. The thought tightened his chest. When he crawled back toward camp, the backpack strap still pointed north, as if the creature had been trying to pull him away from the place where someone was shooting. Ethan returned to camp with his arm throbbing, clothes covered in mud, and breathing, still unsteady after the encounter. He knew he could not stay until morning. The tent was torn, the stove had been overturned, and the gunshots proved someone was moving through the area. Ethan shoved his phone, knife, first aid kit, and the remaining food into a small bag. When he checked the side pocket of the backpack, he discovered the emergency pager and car keys were missing. He searched the mud with the flashlight, but found only his own boot prints crossing over large depressions leading north. Not wanting to lose more time, Ethan decided to return to the Subaru and start it with the spare key, hidden under the trunk mat. He left camp and moved quickly along the old route, every step slipping on wet roots. Behind him, branches cracked at intervals, close enough for him to know he was still being watched. Nearly an hour later, Ethan reached the drainage cut, where a small wooden bridge crossed the road. The bridge had collapsed into the rising water. Its support beams had been cleanly cut with a saw, the exposed wood still bright beneath the rain. This was not storm damage. Someone had destroyed the way back after he had crossed it. Ethan followed the bank, looking for a place to cross, but flashlights appeared between the trees. On the opposite side, he dropped behind a rotten log. Two men were talking in low voices. They mentioned the large female and the small specimen. One asked whether the camper was dead. The other answered that they had found the destroyed tent but no body, then said they could not let a witness leave the valley before the work was done. Ethan pressed himself flat to the ground, hand tight around the knife handle. He did not know whether they were poachers, researchers, or animal traffickers, but the suppressed rifle and saw-cut bridge had already answered the only question that mattered. When the two beams moved away, Ethan backed from the bank and turned north, where the terrain climbed steeper but might lead toward the old ranger station. He had not gone 10 minutes when he saw the emergency pager lying in the middle of the trail. Its casing had been smashed. The buttons were cracked into pieces. There were no teeth marks. Beside it, 3 branches had been arranged into an arrow pointing toward the ranger station. Ethan stood in the rain, trying to decide whether this was guidance or another trap. Then, from below the slope ahead, came a very weak groan. He stepped to the edge, shone the light down, and saw a small fur-covered hand trying to pull at a steel cable tightened around an ankle. Ethan slid down the slope with one hand gripping roots, the other holding the flashlight toward the groan beneath the rain. As he came closer, he saw a small creature lying on its side near a rock hollow, its right foot caught in a steel cable snare connected to an industrial spring anchored deep into a tree. It was about 4 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur, darkened by water. Its feet were wide, but the toes curled almost like human toes. Each time it tried to pull free, the cable tightened more, swelling the skin around the ankle and smearing it with mud. The young creature did not roar. It only made short, choked sounds, like a child trying to stay calm, because any movement made the pain worse. Ethan stopped a few steps away, lowered the flashlight, and placed the knife on the ground. He knew an injured creature could react violently, especially if it could not understand weather. The human approaching was there to help or finish what the trap had started. He knelt, kept both hands visible, and said slowly that he would not hurt it. The young creature raised one arm to shield its face, then pulled the cable again. Ethan stopped immediately and waited until its breathing slowed before moving closer inch by inch. When he examined the mechanism, he realized it had been designed to keep the animal alive. The springs strong enough to lock the leg, but the cable angle avoided fully cutting off blood flow. On the metal lock was the marking HV3, and Ethan understood this was the 3rd trap in a prepared system. He took pliers from the tool pouch, but as soon as the jaws touched the cable, a powerful knock rang from above the slope. Ethan lifted his head and saw the adult creature that had destroyed his tent standing between 2 cedars. Rain ran through its black-brown fur. The area around its eyes was swollen red from the bear spray, and the silver stripe still showed clearly across its right shoulder. It looked at Ethan, then at the pliers, then down at the young creature. Its large hand tightened around the tree beside it so hard that the bark split into long cracks. Ethan understood that one rushed movement could end everything right there. He set down the pliers, pointed to the cable, then opened both hands to show he was trying to remove it. The adult did not come closer, but released a deep sound like a warning. Ethan inhaled, picked up the pliers, and set the cutter against the secondary lock. At that moment, a red dot appeared on the young creature's chest, motionless in the wet fur. Ethan immediately lowered himself, tracing the line of light back toward the woods. It was a laser from a rifle aimed down the slope. Ethan lunged sideways and pulled the young creature behind a fallen tree just as a dry puff sounded. From the slope, a dart struck the moss where the red dot had been and trembled in the rain. 3 figures stepped out between the cedars, spread wide enough to cover Ethan and the adult creature. The leader was about 50, wearing a dark hunting raincoat and carrying a dart rifle with a scope. He called Ethan by name, his voice calm, as if the 2 men had already met. Ethan realized they had searched his car or camp. The man introduced himself as Cole Vance, a representative for a private wildlife research group, and ordered Ethan to move away from the specimen so they could handle it. Behind Vance, Travis Rudd held a suppressed rifle. Mason Pike carried a coil of steel cable and a box of sedatives. Ethan looked at the equipment and knew this was not a rescue. Vance said they had been tracking the creature family for nearly 2 years, recording movement routes, food habits, and reactions to sound. According to him, a live juvenile could unlock a research contract worth millions, while footprints and blurry video would only make people laugh. Ethan stretched the conversation by asking how many traps they had set while moving the pliers toward the secondary lock. Vance noticed, lowered his rifle, and warned that if Ethan cut the wrong point, the young creature could lose its foot. On the high slope, the adult creature moved between trees and threw a rock to the left, making Travis turn his head. That moment of distraction was enough for Ethan to clamp the cutters onto the metal pin. Mason panicked, raised a handgun, and fired a real bullet into the ground in front of the adult. The gunshot made the young creature jerk, and the cable instantly bit deeper into its ankle. Ethan put all his strength into the handles. The secondary pin snapped. The spring whipped back against his forearm, but the cable fell from the young creature's foot. The young one tried to stand and collapsed from pain. Vance rushed down several steps, ordering Ethan to move aside. The adult creature charged down the slope, each heavy footstep shaking the soft ground. Travis and Mason backed away. Ethan covered his head and pressed flat into the mud, thinking he was about to be trampled. But the female creature stopped beside the young one and lifted it with one arm. With her other hand, she touched Ethan's shoulder and pushed him into a rock crack, just as a dart flew through the place where he had been lying. She looked at him for one brief beat, eyes still red from the bear spray but completely alert, then carried the young one into the forest, disappearing through the shaking trees. Ethan lifted his head and understood the creature that had destroyed his tent had just saved his life. Ethan left the rock crack after Vance's group had moved away, but the forearm struck by the spring began swelling beneath his wet sleeve. He had run less than 100 meters when he slipped on a root, slammed his knee into the ground, and lost his breath. He crawled into the hollow beneath a fallen cedar's root system, trying to hold back a groan while flashlights swept the slope behind him. A few minutes later, a large shadow appeared in the rain. The female creature stood several steps away, still holding the young one in one arm. She watched the woods behind Ethan, then crouched and placed the young one near the root hollow. The young creature curled its injured leg tight against its body, eyes shifting between its mother and the man lying in the mud. The adult looked at Ethan's swollen forearm, pulled a handful of low leaves from the ground, chewed them quickly, then pushed the wet bundle toward him. Ethan did not know whether it was medicine, food, or some kind of signal. He set the leaves aside, took medical wrap from his pouch and bound his arm tightly. The creature did not seem offended. She made 3 deep sounds, then pointed to the young one with a thick finger. Ethan understood the request in the simplest way. He moved closer, placed the pliers and knife far away, and examined the trapped ankle. The wound was badly swollen, with torn skin, but the bone did not seem broken. Ethan rinsed the mud with clean water, applied antiseptic, and wrapped the injury loosely so circulation would not be cut off. When the young one flinched from pain, the mother's hand clenched around a tree trunk, breaking the bark into pieces. But she remained still, watching every movement until the young one's breathing eased. In his mind, Ethan called the adult Mara, after a mother he had once rescued from a car accident. He called the young one Red because of the reddish-brown fur visible under the flashlight. When Ethan stood, Mara lifted Red and moved parallel behind the trees instead of walking beside him. Each time he drifted away from the direction of the ranger station, a small stone fell onto the path he needed to take. Ethan began to understand that this was an unspoken agreement. Mara needed his skills. He needed her eyes to survive Vance's group. Near the ranger station, Mara suddenly pulled Red into the brush. Ethan took a few more steps and saw a nearly invisible tripwire stretched at ankle height, connected to a homemade flashbang hidden beneath leaves. If Mara had not warned him, Ethan's next step would have triggered it. He stood motionless, feeling rainwater slide cold down his spine, and understood that the poachers had prepared this shelter to receive them. Ethan knelt before the clear wire, held the tension pin in place with a branch, and used paracord to secure the firing mechanism. The homemade flashbang was hidden under rotting leaves, aimed straight at the path to the ranger station. Its placement showed it was designed to stun a large creature stepping through, not simply keep strangers away. After disabling the trap, Ethan approached the old wooden cabin, standing among the cedars. The roof sagged, 2 windows were broken, and moss covered most of the porch steps. But inside were still a wood stove and several metal shelves. Mara stood at the edge of the clearing, holding Red to her chest and constantly watching the dark windows. She refused to cross the threshold, even when Ethan repeatedly signaled that the cabin could keep them out of the rain. He entered alone, carefully checking each corner before turning up the flashlight. On the table near the wall were fresh batteries, boxes of veterinary sedatives, steel cable, and a stack of thermal images printed on waterproof paper. A map above them marked at least 7 locations with the symbol HV, each point connected in a pattern around Alder Creek. Ethan realized Vance's group had turned the entire valley into a systematic hunting ground. In a plastic bin, he found photographs of Mara moving with 2 young ones. Red was only one of them. The next photograph showed a large male creature with gray fur across its back, standing on a mountain slope and staring straight into the camera. Beside the image was a note: "Alpha male, aggressive, eliminate if necessary." Ethan read the sentence twice, disturbed by how these men described a family living in the forest as if they were sorting equipment instead of beings protecting one another. In the corner of the cabin he found an old radio, but the power cable had been cut. Ethan removed batteries from a spare lamp, connected them with 2 short pieces of metal wire, and held the contact points in place with medical tape. The radio speaker came alive with thick static. He turned the frequency knob until he caught a weak ranger channel and was about to read his coordinates when Cole Vance's voice came through. Vance said every signal in the valley passed through a repeater controlled by his group. He offered to return Ethan's car keys and let him leave if he handed over Red before dawn. Ethan turned the radio off, looked toward the window, and saw Mara staring through the broken glass at the photographs. Her eyes lingered on the picture of the 2 young ones, longer than all the others. Ethan's hand froze when he realized the other young creature had a tracking collar around its neck, like a veterinary device. Red stirred and made a weak call. Mara pressed her hand against the glass, as if searching for a familiar face. Ethan turned the photograph over. On the back was a short handwritten line: "Juvenile 1 captured, alive." Ethan held the photograph and pointed to Red, then to the other young creature in the picture. Mara reacted immediately. She snatched the photograph from his hand, released a deep sound, and struck her chest twice before looking toward the dark forest outside the cabin. Before Ethan could find a way to ask more, the radio on the table came alive through static. A high, broken cry came through the speaker, very similar to the sound Red had made when the cable tightened around its foot. Mara lunged through the doorway, struck the side of the table, and bent close to the radio, her huge hands overturning objects as if the captured young one were somewhere inside the room. Ethan kept his distance, afraid one wrong movement would make her smash the only device that could help them identify the location. Cole Vance's voice appeared after the static. He said the second creature was still alive, but the sedative level in its body was falling fast. If Ethan wanted to avoid a bloody confrontation, he had to bring Red to Blackfern Mine before dawn. Mara heard the cry again and turned to Ethan. Her eyes were clear enough for him to understand she would go, no matter how many traps were ahead. Ethan opened the map and found the mine almost 6 miles from the cabin. The shortest route passed through low ground already filling with rainwater, then crossed an old suspension bridge over a gorge. He pointed to Red, then to the cabin floor, using both hands to signal that the young one should stay. Mara held Red closer and shook her head slowly but firmly. Ethan understood she would not lose another child. He checked Red's wound again, replaced the wet bandage, and made a cloth sling so Mara could carry the young one without pressing on the swollen ankle. Before leaving the cabin, Ethan searched the metal cabinet near the stove and found a handheld recorder. The most recent clip contained an argument between Vance and an unknown man. The other man wanted to stop the hunt after the male specimen attacked them 3 weeks earlier. Vance answered that anyone who walked away now would lose their share of the money, and possibly more than that. Ethan took the recorder with him, realizing the gray-backed male in the photograph might still be alive. They left the cabin as the rain eased slightly. A deep howl sounded from the eastern ridge. Mara stopped, lifted her head, and answered with a long, low sound. Seconds later, a second howl echoed back from closer by. Mara instantly whipped one arm out and pulled Ethan to the ground. He looked up and saw a small speaker tied behind a tree, its wire leading to a sensor hidden under moss. Someone was using her family's voice to lead them into a hunting corridor. Ethan stayed flat until the speaker stopped playing the howl, then crawled to the roots where the wire disappeared beneath the moss. He lifted the wet soil with the tip of his knife and found a small motion sensor connected to a waterproof battery. Nearby were an infrared camera, 2 cloth bags filled with animal scent, and 3 fake branches tied with fishing line in the exact pattern of the signs Mara had used. Ethan looked around the forest as unease turned into deeper suspicion. Vance's group was not only tracking the Sasquatch family. They had learned to imitate their signals, scents, and travel signs, turning the whole valley into one enormous trap. That forced Ethan to reconsider everything from the first night. The branch arrow that led him to Red may have been made by Mara, but the smashed pager, the missing keys, and several signs around his camp could have been set by humans. He began to understand that the greatest danger was not lacking evidence. It was that every piece of evidence could be faked. Mara held Red and watched Ethan remove the battery from the speaker. The young one looked weaker now, its head resting on its mother's shoulder, the injured leg trembling whenever Mara shifted position. Ethan signaled that they had to circle around the sensor area. He threw a stone west, triggering an electronic chime and indicator, light almost 100 meters away. A few minutes later, Travis and Mason's flashlights appeared in that direction. The 2 men spoke softly over the radio, believing the target had entered the secondary hunting lane. Ethan led Mara down a dry water channel and into a hollow beneath a fallen trunk. The space was so tight that his shoulder pressed against rotten wood, while Mara had to lie on her side, keeping Red between her chest and the ground. Travis passed less than 10 feet away. Ethan could hear the rifle mechanism brushing his raincoat and his voice reporting that Vance was moving the captured creature out of the mine, because the gray male had returned to the mountains. Mason asked whether the creature was still injured after the previous encounter. Travis answered that the wound did not make it any less dangerous, then urged the other man to move faster. When the 2 lights disappeared behind the trees, Ethan waited another minute before crawling out. He turned to help Mara lift Red, but the space behind him was empty. In the mud, only one large handprint remained, along with a few drops of water leading north. Mara had disappeared with her child, leaving Ethan alone inside a network of traps where he no longer knew which signals were real. From deep in the forest, a knock sounded. But this time, Ethan did not dare trust that it was Mara calling him. Ethan followed pressed moss and low broken branches, trying to separate Mara's real trail from the false signals Vance's group had planted through the woods. After nearly 20 minutes, he heard Red whimper softly ahead and saw Mara standing at the head of an old suspension bridge over a gorge. Red was already on the opposite bank, curled beside a rock, while Mara stood on this side, both hands gripping the cables as if one more touch would tighten the metal around her body. Ethan understood that the strained sound of the bridge cables had brought back the memory of the snare that had trapped Red's leg. He stepped forward, placed a hand on the railing, and tapped 2 slow, even beats, like the way Mara had signaled before. Then he walked backward, step by step, keeping eye contact and continuing the rhythm on the cable. Mara placed 1 foot on the first plank. The bridge immediately sank under her weight, old joints groaning in the wind and rain. Ethan kept the rhythm going, urging her forward, even though he felt every board shake beneath his own feet. When they were almost at the middle, a dry puff came from behind them. The first dart struck a support cable. The second swept past Ethan's shoulder. Mason stepped from the trees, dart rifle braced on his shoulder, face tight when he saw Mara nearly reaching the far side. He fired again, trying to make her panic. Mara sprang forward, breaking 2 planks loose from the frame. Ethan lost footing. 1 leg dropped through the gap, and his body hung from the cable. Mason stepped onto the bridge, believing Mara would abandon the man to protect Red. Mara turned back. She crouched low, seized the back of Ethan's jacket, and pulled him over the broken planks with such force that his back slammed onto the bridge floor. Ethan crawled to the far bank, then used his knife to cut an old secondary rope connected to the railing. When Mason reached the center, the bridge frame tilted hard to one side. He dropped the dart rifle, grabbed the cable, and had to retreat to avoid falling into the water below. Ethan, Mara, and Red ran into the woods. Behind them, the bridge sagged away from its supports, making it difficult for Vance's group to cross quickly. Ethan started to believe they had enough distance to reach the mine before the others. He bent to check Red's bandage when a thin buzzing appeared above the canopy. A small drone lifted from the far side of the gorge, turning its camera straight toward them. A red light on its body switched on, confirming their position had been transmitted. From a speaker beneath the drone, Vance's calm voice came down. He said he could see them very clearly. Ethan pulled Mara and Red away from the open ground as the drone dropped lower, then struck at it with a long branch. The camera shook violently, but did not fall. Mara picked up a stone and threw it into the propeller. The machine spun out and crashed into the ferns. Ethan knew the signal had already been sent. They had only minutes before Vance's group changed direction. Black Fern Mine appeared beyond a rock slope. A main tunnel, a metal storage shed, and a generator running beneath a temporary cover. White lights around the site made it look more like a field research station than an abandoned mine. Ethan studied the cameras near the tunnel entrance and realized Vance wanted them to go through the main way. He led Mara around the slope, where an old ventilation opening was almost hidden by vines. Red was placed inside a dry hollow with a water bottle, and Ethan's jacket rolled beneath it for support. Mara hesitated to leave her child, but a weak cry from inside the mine made her turn instantly toward the vent. Ethan crawled first through the narrow passage, wet stones scraping his shoulders and knees. When they reached a wider chamber, the sound of claws against metal came from behind a sheet metal wall. Inside was a livestock transport cage. A second young creature lay on its side, a tracking collar around its neck, both arms hanging through the bars. It was larger than Red, with fur so dark it was almost black. and its breathing was slow from sedatives. Ethan called it Ash. Mara rushed forward, but an electric current flashed across the low fence and threw her backward. Ethan found the control panel, pulled the breaker, then used pliers to cut the backup wire. When the warning lights went out, Mara placed both hands on the cage and made a deep vibration in her chest. Ethan opened the lock, checked Ash's pupils and breathing, then helped Mara lift the young one out. From the ventilation opening, Red answered, weak but clear. For one short moment, Ethan believed they had reached the mine before Vance and gotten both young ones out of the trap. Then the steel door behind them slammed shut. Lights along the corridor snapped on, revealing Cole Vance standing on the raised walkway with a dart rifle in his hands. He said Ash had never been the final target. The two young ones were bait to draw both the female and the gray-backed male into the same place. Vance pointed down to a screen, mounted beside the railing. The live feed showed Travis outside with Red located but not yet captured. He was holding his rifle on the brush, waiting for Mara to react. Ethan turned to Mara and saw her entire body tense between staying with Ash and rushing back for Red. At that moment, a massive impact sounded from the dark tunnel behind Ethan. A place the map showed had no exit at all. Vance stopped speaking, lowered the rifle, and stared into the darkness as it began to tremble under slow, heavy footsteps drawing closer. From the dark tunnel behind Ethan, an enormous figure stepped into the flickering mine lights. The male creature stood almost 8 feet tall, gray-silver fur covering its back, one ear torn, and a round-heeled scar at the center of its chest. Each step made dust fall from the ceiling, but its eyes went first to Mara, then to Ash in the mother's arms. Mara released a chain of short sounds and knocked twice against the rock wall. The male looked at Ethan, shoulders tight, then came close enough for warm breath to touch Ethan's hand. Mara immediately stood between them, one arm holding Ash, the other stretched across Ethan's chest like a boundary. She tapped the rock again, slower this time, then pointed to the bandage on Ash's leg and the wound on Ethan's arm. The male crouched, sniffed Ethan's fingertips, then looked at the pliers on the ground. Ethan understood Mara was telling him this man had helped their children. On the high walkway, Vance raised the dart rifle and fired. The male leaned aside and avoided the shot, then picked up a wooden mine support and hurled it into the railing. The impact bent the metal, forcing Vance back from his position. He instantly activated a device on the wall. A thin sound filled the tunnel, so high Ethan felt it more as pressure deep in his ears than as noise. But all three Sasquatch reacted violently. Mara dropped to her knees, holding Ash tight. The male pounded both hands against the wall. Ash began convulsing as the sedatives and high frequency combined. Ethan removed the hearing aid from his left ear, the one he had used since an old injury, and realized the intensity of the sound changed depending on where he turned his head. He followed the wire along the ceiling to an amplifier behind a metal shield. Vance fired another dart, but Ethan rolled behind the cage, grabbed an emergency axe, and brought it down hard on the control box. Sparks burst out. The sound vanished. The male stopped pounding the wall, breathing heavily, and looked at Ethan with suspicion that had softened. He lifted Ash while Mara turned toward the tunnel entrance where Red was being held outside. Ethan looked at the huge hand that had once dragged his tent, then remembered how Mara had pulled him north, toward where Red was trapped, before gunfire turned everything chaotic. The first night attack had never been a hunt. Mara had been trying to force him away from a camp set in the middle of a trap system, but the bear spray had turned her warning into a confrontation. That realization left Ethan ashamed and more alert than ever. He picked up Vance's recorder and checked the screen. The device was automatically uploading data to a remote server. If Vance escaped the forest, the coordinates of the Sasquatch family would be sold to other hunters. Ethan looked at the progress bar on the recorder screen and understood they had little time. Data from the mine was being transferred to a server. Thermal images, coordinate maps, and behavior logs of the Sasquatch family. He opened the technical cabinet and found a portable server inside a waterproof case, connected to a satellite transmitter. The easiest solution was to remove the hard drive, carry it out of the forest, and hand it to police. But that brought another risk. Any agency, research institute, or media outlet that possessed the data could turn Mara's family shelter into a hunting destination. Ethan remembered something Daniel had once said in a recording. Humans often destroy the things they try to prove, because when a secret becomes valuable, someone will want to own it. That memory made Ethan's choice clear. He would destroy the data, even if it meant leaving the forest with no evidence to defend his story. Mara stood near the tunnel entrance, looking toward where Red was being held outside. The gray-backed male held Ash. Ethan pointed to the screen showing Vance, then to Mara, Ash, and the path out of the mine. He used a stone to sketch a simple map, showing that Vance would keep chasing them if the metal box still worked. The male did not understand the server, but when he recognized Vance's face on the screen, he slammed a hand against the image. Ethan found a drainage tunnel under the eastern side of the mine, wide enough for the Sasquatch family to carry the two young ones out. He signaled Mara to lead Red and Ash first, while he returned to the shed to destroy the storage. Mara held his wrist for a few seconds, then let go. The gray-backed male stepped closer and placed his hand on Ethan's chest, exactly where Mara had struck twice when referring to the captured child. Ethan answered with 2 slow taps, treating it as a promise that he would return. After the family entered the drainage route, Ethan crawled through the side corridor and reached the storage shed. He opened the server case, removed the protective cover, and pulled out the first data tray. Inside were many folders labeled by location, date, and person. Ethan found a list of 11 disappearance cases around the Olympic Peninsula, with notes about people who had reported footprints or strange sounds. He read each line, feeling cold spread from the back of his neck down his spine. At the bottom of the list, under a date 3 years earlier, Daniel Cole's name appeared clearly, beside his family address. Ethan placed a hand against the screen. Vance's footsteps began sounding outside the corridor. Ethan kept his eyes on Daniel's file while footsteps approached in the hallway. He opened the first document and realized it was not about the accident that had taken his brother's life. 6 months before he died, Daniel had sent an email to a local Bigfoot forum describing large footprints near Alder Creek and a tall shadow standing by the creek at dusk. Vance had saved Daniel's address, phone number, and workplace, then classified him as a person to monitor. At the bottom of the page was a cold note, unreliable, no intervention needed. Ethan read the sentence again, his hand shaking with anger and relief. Vance had not caused the accident, but he had known Daniel had been in this forest and had kept silent about what he had seen. In the photo folder, Ethan found a picture of his brother standing beside an old car. Far behind Daniel's shoulder, Mara and a young creature were partly hidden among the trees. The storage room door opened. Cole Vance stepped in, handgun lowered beside his leg, his expression calmer than the situation should have allowed. He looked at the screen and said Daniel had refused to sell coordinates, had deleted the original photos, and had blocked all contact after their first meeting. Vance told Ethan he was repeating his brother's choice, except that this time the evidence could change history. He offered to let Ethan keep a copy of the data, publish the discovery with him, and force the government to protect the species under federal law. For a few seconds, the argument sounded almost reasonable. Ethan understood that a confirmed species could receive protected habitat, funding, and scientific oversight. But the steel traps, sedatives, electric fence, and Ash's cry were still too clear in his mind. Ethan asked what kind of protection began by tightening cable around a child's foot. Vance answered that every great discovery had a price. Then he stepped closer and looked at Daniel's backpack on Ethan's shoulder. His eyes paused on the old strap, as if he had just recognized an important detail. Vance said Mara had seen Daniel carrying that backpack many times, and probably remembered its smell and shape. He smirked, and said that was the reason the female had not killed Ethan on the first night. Ethan gripped the backpack strap and understood his brother had once been closer to that family than he had ever imagined. That sentence changed the color of the entire trip in his memory. Ethan realized Mara had looked at the backpack before she looked at his face, and her hesitation outside the tent may have come from a man who had treated her family with kindness. Ethan lowered his eyes from the screen and kept his voice calm as he told Vance he was right about one thing. Evidence was too important to destroy in a few minutes of anger. Vance studied him, clearly unconvinced, but his confidence made him willing to hear more. Ethan asked to see how the data uploaded to the server. He said that if they were going to publish together, he needed to know where the copies were and who controlled access. Vance stepped to the control panel, turning his back just enough for Ethan to grab the fire extinguisher on the wall. White powder blasted into Vance's face. He staggered. Ethan lunged forward and ripped the power cable from the outlet. The screen went dark for one heartbeat, then came back on through backup battery. Ethan realized he would have to destroy each drive by hand. He pulled out the first tray, slammed it to the floor, and crushed the circuit board under his boot. Before he reached the second, Travis appeared from the hallway and struck him in the shoulder with the rifle stock, knocking Ethan backward into the table. The two men struggled among wires and metal boxes. Ethan grabbed Travis's wrist, trying to push the muzzle away, but a shot still fired, punching through a thin wall and into the generator fuel tank. Fuel began running across the floor, spreading toward the torn electrical wires. From deep in the mine, the gray-backed male roared in answer to Mara's panic call. Vance wiped powder from his eyes, ran to a secondary control panel, and triggered the steel door. The metal barrier dropped between the tunnel sections, separating Mara and Red from the male, still carrying Ash. Ethan heard huge hands slamming metal from both sides, each impact shaking the shed. He tore away from Travis, seized the second hard drive, and smashed it against the edge of the table until the casing cracked open. Vance grabbed the final drive from the tray, shoved it into his coat, and backed toward the door. Ethan knew that drive held the newest coordinates and the clearest images of the Sasquatch family. Travis looked at Vance and asked whether this hunt was still about research or had become only a sale. Vance replied that whoever carried the evidence out of the forest first would decide how history was told, then ordered him to hold Ethan back. The answer made Travis hesitate, but not long enough to change sides. Ethan saw fuel creeping toward sparks under the electrical panel, while Mara kept calling to Red from beyond the steel door. A small pop sounded. Fire ran along the floor and burst into a wall of heat, blocking the drainage route Ethan had planned to use to get the whole family out. Black smoke rolled across the low ceiling. Ethan realized the rescue plan had collapsed right in front of him. Black smoke filled the tunnel faster than Ethan expected, rolling along the ceiling before sinking toward face level as flames caught in the old wooden supports. He ran to the steel door, blocking Mara and Red on the other side, shoved a metal bar into the locking gap, and forced upward. The door shook hard, but the inner mechanism was jammed. Mara's calls through the steel grew shorter and sharper with each passing minute. On the opposite side of the mine, the gray-backed male still held Ash, but was blocked by a cave-in and could not reach them. Ethan heard the two adults calling through layers of rock, every sound carrying the tension of a family split in two. He looked up and saw a small ventilation opening above the door. It was the only route to the emergency hand crank. Ethan climbed the steel frame and squeezed into the narrow space, barely wide enough for his shoulders. Broken stone scraped his shirt, smoke burned his eyes. Still, he crawled forward until part of the ceiling suddenly dropped, pinning his right leg between two rocks. Ethan pulled several times and realized Daniel's backpack had caught on a metal edge, holding him in place. He slipped off the strap, left the backpack behind, and dragged his leg free with the last of his strength. When he reached the crank, he turned it hard until the door mechanism began lifting in sections. Below, fire had reached the backpack. Mara saw it through the gap, immediately lowered herself, reached one arm through, and pulled it from the flames before returning to hold Red. Ethan froze for a beat, because her reaction showed she recognized the bag that had once belonged to Daniel. The steel door rose high enough for Mara to crawl through, but the smoke was thick and disorienting. She kept turning her head, searching for the gray-backed male. Ethan took out his phone, played Daniel's voice recording, and turned the volume as high as possible. The familiar voice sounded through the fire. Mara stopped, listened, then led Red toward the clearer corridor, following the sound. At the other end of the mine, the gray-backed male broke part of the fallen rock wall, but a large slab struck his shoulder and drove him to one knee. Ash still lay limp in his arms. Ethan saw the exit and knew Vance was escaping with the hard drive, but he turned back. He crawled through the rocks, used a metal bar as a lever, and helped the male push the slab off his shoulder. Ethan felt his own body trembling from exhaustion, but the male's eyes had lost some of their guardedness. Between fire, smoke, and collapsing stone, a fragile trust formed. As they finally escaped, the sound of a pickup engine rose outside. Vance was leaving with the final proof. Ethan stumbled out of the mine through smoke, pouring over the roof of the storage shed, and saw three men facing one another beside the vehicles. Cole Vance held the hard drive in his coat pocket, his other hand close to his handgun. Travis had his rifle aimed at him, demanding a share of the money before anyone left the valley. Vance said the data was only valuable with the contacts, lawyers, and investors he had prepared. A storage device in the hands of a nobody, he said, was just something easy to confiscate. From the western road, Mason appeared in soaked clothing, face red with anger after crawling through the gorge alone. He turned his gun toward both men, reminding Vance that he had abandoned him at the bridge and intended to carry all the credit out of the forest. Three guns formed a tense triangle while Ethan hid behind an off-road vehicle near the shed, trying to find the keys without being seen. Mason revealed that before the signal went down, he had hired a helicopter to reach the pickup point at Fire Lookout Ridge after dawn. Vance's eyes changed. He understood that if he kept the hard drive a few more hours, all the data would leave the Olympic Peninsula before rangers could arrive. Travis spotted Ethan through a gap between the vehicles. He said nothing. After a few seconds of calculation, Travis took a key ring from his pocket and tossed it low across the ground, letting it slide near the off-road vehicle's tire. Travis whispered that Ethan could take the vehicle, but in exchange, he had to forget his name, if anyone survived. Ethan picked up the keys and said he promised nothing to a man who aimed a gun at a family protecting its children. The honesty tightened Travis's jaw, but he still turned his weapon back toward Vance. Ethan climbed into the vehicle, started the engine, and accelerated across the clearing, forcing Mason aside. Vance immediately jumped into the pickup and followed. Travis stayed behind among smoke and fire, preparing to betray whoever would be useful next. As the off-road vehicle raced down the eastern road, Ethan understood Travis had not helped out of remorse. He was afraid Vance would erase him once he had the evidence. Behind him, the pickup engine drew closer. Ethan glanced at the dashboard clock, estimated the distance to Fire Lookout Ridge, and realized he had less than 3 hours before the helicopter arrived. The road ahead was drowning in rain, the wheels slipping from the ruts, while the pickup headlights behind him swept across the trees. like a warning gaining ground. The off-road vehicle began jerking violently as Ethan drove through a flooded section. Then the engine died completely in deep water. He turned the key twice more, but heard only dry clicking while Vance's pickup lights appeared around the bend. Ethan jumped out and pulled the tool bag from the side of the vehicle, just as the pickup accelerated straight toward him. He rolled toward the edge of the road as the front bumper hit the off-road vehicle, spinning it sideways and shoving both vehicles through the mud. The impact knocked Ethan off balance. He fell down the bank, rolled through ferns, and slammed his shoulder into a stump. The phone, knife, and first aid kit flew from his pouch, and his right ankle burned with pain the moment he tried to stand. Above him, Vance killed the engine and stepped out, sweeping the slope with a flashlight. Ethan lay pressed under wet leaves, keeping his breathing shallow and slow, though each heartbeat slammed against his ribs. Vance passed less than a few meters away and did not see the jacket hidden under mud. He called on a satellite phone, confirmed the pickup point at Fire Lookout Ridge, and asked the pilot to arrive. Earlier, Ethan heard him report that the mine had burned, the specimens might be dead, and the hard drive was still secure. After Vance returned to the pickup and drove off, Ethan forced himself upright. His ankle was swelling quickly, making every step unstable. He found the phone under a low bush. The screen was cracked, but Daniel's recording would still play. The battery showed only 3%. The backpack, map, and most of his supplies were gone after the crash. Rain kept raising the water, erasing Vance's tire tracks and turning the road into a slick line of mud. Ethan tried moving east, but had to lean against a tree after less than 20 steps. For the first time since entering the valley, he felt every choice had been taken from him. A knock sounded far away. Ethan picked up a branch, knocked twice in reply, and waited in the rain. The forest stayed silent. So long he began thinking Mara had left, or that the whole family was trapped beneath the mine. He lowered his head, hand clenched around the dying phone. Then 3 branches dropped in front of him, arranged into an arrow pointing up the slope. From behind a tree, Red stepped out, one leg still wrapped in the bandage Ethan had tied. The young one looked at him, made a short sound, then turned away. Ethan used the branch as a cane and followed. When he reached the top of the slope, Mara and the gray-backed male were standing beside Daniel's backpack. Inside the side pocket, Ethan's car keys were still there. Ethan opened the side pocket of the backpack and saw the key ring lying between medical tape and Daniel's lighter. For a few seconds, he thought Mara had taken them from camp, but the marks on the backpack helped him reconstruct the events more clearly. On the first night, Mara had dragged the backpack north because she wanted Ethan to leave the trapline and go to the place where Red was caught. After being hit by bear spray, she must have dropped the backpack. While fleeing, Vance's group found it, took the keys, and brought the bag to the mine. When the fire broke out, Mara recognized Daniel's backpack, pulled it from the flames, and kept it until she found Ethan. That explanation made every final detail fit. Mara understood the object belonged to Ethan and had once belonged to Daniel, but she did not know the small metal keys inside could open his car. Ethan sat down and checked Red and Ash. Red was limping but alert. Ash had opened its eyes, though the sedative still made its body weak. The gray-backed male held one wounded arm close to his chest, his shoulder badly swollen from the falling rock inside the mine. Ethan removed an aluminum strip from the backpack frame, bent it to the right angle, and tied his forearm in place with cloth. He wrapped his ankle, then used a branch to draw a map in the wet ground. He marked the mine, the roundabout road, and Fire Lookout Ridge, where Vance was heading to meet the helicopter. Ethan pointed to the Sasquatch family, then toward the deep forest, trying to signal that they should leave the area before the aircraft arrived. Mara studied the lines, but instead of turning away, she used one finger to erase Ethan's helicopter symbol. then drew a steep route straight over the mountain. The gray-backed male placed his hand on that line and looked at Ethan, as if confirming they knew a shorter path. Ethan realized they had decided to join him because Vance still carried the coordinates to the places where their children lived. He wanted to object, but Red stepped up beside Mara, and Ash leaned against the male's leg. This was no longer only Ethan's escape. He put the cracked phone, the recorder, and the keys into his pocket, then struck his chest twice to say he was ready. Just as they prepared to leave the slope, a moving light appeared beneath the cloud layer. The helicopter blades echoed through the valley, growing clearer. Ethan looked up and understood. The helicopter had arrived almost an hour early. The little time they had left forced them to move at once. The Sasquatch family left the slope first, moving across steep rock that Ethan had to climb with both hands and knees. Mara guided Red and Ash along firmer ground, while the gray-backed male walked behind Ethan, occasionally breaking a large branch and driving it into the mud to give him something to grip. His injured ankle made every step send sharp pain through him, but the growing sound of helicopter blades stripped away any thought of rest. Below in the valley, Vance's pickup lights moved through the bends of the long road. Ethan looked at the distance and understood Vance was taking a longer route, but the vehicle was still much faster than an injured man climbing a mountain. At a vertical rock section, the gray-backed male caught Ethan's forearm, pulled him across the slick stone, and set him on a narrow ledge. The movement was powerful but controlled, as if the creature had begun to understand how easily human bodies could break. Mara kept looking back to check both young ones, while Red insisted on walking with its bandaged foot instead of being carried. Ash was weaker and leaned most of its weight against the male's arm, but whenever the helicopter echoed overhead, the young one lifted its head and made a worried sound. Near the ridge, Ethan found an old mining cable running across a rock gap. He tied paracord to the metal ring, creating a sliding line to get himself down the far side faster. The Sasquatch did not need it. Mara and the male moved across the rock shelves with such precision that Ethan felt they had used this route many times. When the group reached a circle of snapped trees, Mara suddenly stopped. Inside the clearing were old handprints, pressed into weathered wood, and a piece of blue fabric caught beneath a root. Ethan picked it up and immediately recognized it as part of the jacket Daniel had worn in the last photograph. The fabric was faded by rain and sun, but the stitching along the edge was identical. Ethan wanted to stop and understand how his brother had reached this place, but the helicopter descending overhead forced him to put the fabric into his pocket. Mara looked at him, touched the backpack softly, then turned toward the ridge, as if confirming that Daniel had once stood here. Vance had arrived first by the roundabout road, leaving tire tracks in the mud. Ethan also saw Mason standing near the base of the lookout tower, his rifle held low at his side, eyes moving between the sky and the forest. The selfish alliance between the two poachers had not fully broken. When Ethan stepped out of the final tree line, Fire Lookout Ridge appeared under hard rain and wind. The helicopter was still circling, unable to land. In the middle of the clearing, Vance was waiting, one hand holding the hard drive, the other aiming a gun straight at Mara's chest. Vance kept the gun on Mara, while a sound device on his chest released a thin frequency that made both adult Sasquatch hunch their shoulders and retreat from the clearing. Red and Ash hid behind the trees, making short calls, while the helicopter circled above and rotor wash drove the rain sideways. Ethan stepped out of the forest with both hands raised. Vance ordered him to stop, then declared that the hard drive already had an encrypted copy sent out. Ethan watched how tightly Vance held the device and understood it was a bluff. If a copy existed, Vance would not be risking his life on the ridge. Mason stood a few steps away, eyes fixed more on the drive than on the gun. As the helicopter lowered to search for a landing spot, The engine noise and the frequency from the device drove Mara to her knees, both hands gripping her head. The gray-backed male stepped forward, injured shoulder trembling. Each time he approached, Vance increased the power. Ethan waited until Mason looked toward the helicopter, then lunged toward the sound device. Vance fired, and the bullet struck the ground beside Ethan's foot. Mason grabbed Vance's arm, holding the hard drive, and the two men struggled in the wind. The device fell into the mud but kept transmitting. Ethan dropped to his knees, picked up a rock, and smashed the speaker until the casing broke open. The sound vanished. The gray-backed male crossed the clearing, eyes locked on Vance. Ethan stepped in front of him, arms spread. Even though he knew the creature behind him could throw him aside with one motion. He looked straight at the male, struck his chest twice, and shook his head. If Vance died in front of the helicopter camera, the family would be turned into a dangerous target in the eyes of the public. The male stopped an arm's length from Ethan, warm breath rolling over his shoulder. After several tense seconds, it lowered its hand. Vance used that moment. He shoved Mason down and ran toward the edge of the clearing where the helicopter had lowered a rope ladder. Mara turned toward Red and Ash. Ethan tried to run, but his ankle buckled and he fell into the mud. Mason charged at Vance, demanding his share before he left. Vance drove his shoulder into him, ripped the hard drive free and grabbed the rope ladder. Wind slammed the ladder against the lookout tower, forcing the pilot to lift and lower again. The gray-backed male picked up a log and hurled it into the ground in front of Vance. The impact knocked him off balance. The hard drive slipped from his hand and skidded through the mud toward the edge of the cliff. Ethan crawled and caught it just before it fell into the floodwater below. From the southern road, Ranger vehicle lights appeared, climbing toward the clearing after they had seen smoke from the mine. Vance clung to the ladder and shouted that the hard drive was the only proof that could change history. Ethan looked at the device in his hand, then at Mara, holding both young ones close to her chest. He understood that this truth would never belong only to science if it brought new traps with it. As the Rangers came within a few dozen meters, Ethan raised the hard drive in front of Vance, let him see it one last time, then threw it into the gorge where floodwater swallowed it. The Sasquatch family withdrew into the forest just before the Ranger vehicles stopped in the clearing. Mara carried Red and Ash, while the gray-backed male followed behind, shoulders still uneven from injury. A young ranger only managed to see branches shaking violently and one large shadow vanish beyond the rock slope. He raised his flashlight, but the rain swallowed every trace before the rest of the team arrived. Vance was pulled from the rope ladder and handcuffed after Rangers found suppressed firearms, veterinary sedatives, steel cable, and stun devices in the vehicles. The first charges involved illegal hunting, damaging a public road, using unauthorized animal control chemicals, and unlawful weapons possession. No report mentioned Sasquatch because the people present saw only the aftermath, not the full cause. Mason claimed they were hunting bears, but the story quickly fell apart when Rangers found electric fencing and transport cages designed for creatures far larger than black bears. Travis appeared 2 days later, handing over equipment receipts, mine photographs, and financial records and charges in exchange for reduced charges. Had burned with shed or been carried away in the gorge with the hard drive. Ethan was taken to a hospital in Port Angeles with an injured arm, sprained ankle, and severe dehydration. Rachel arrived the next morning with a clean jacket and anger she did not try to hide. She sat beside his bed and asked what had attacked his tent. Ethan looked at the bandage on his arm and said the creature had tried to save him in the only way it knew. Police listened to his account but noted exhaustion, trauma, and stress related to Daniel's death. Ethan understood why they doubted him and did not argue. He only asked that the mine be sealed because leaking fuel, animal traps, and dangerous devices were still in the forest. The local news later called the incident a failed poaching operation. Vance stayed silent because mentioning Sasquatch without proof would destroy his credibility. Before Ethan was discharged, Rachel brought Daniel's backpack. Rangers had found it near the mine exit. When Ethan opened the small inner pocket, he found a braided loop made from reddish-brown fur and a faded blue piece of cloth, something that had not been inside before the trip. He held it for a long time, recognizing that Mara had left a thank you private enough for him to understand, but too fragile to convince anyone else. 3 years later, Ethan still worked as an emergency technician in Tacoma, but the way he lived had changed. He no longer used solo trips to hide from grief. Instead, he joined a volunteer search and rescue team on the Olympic Peninsula. Each time he entered the forest, he prepared more carefully, listened more deeply, and respected the boundaries nature placed before him. When coworkers asked about the scar on his arm, Ethan only said he had once been caught in a failed poaching case. The story of Mara, Red Ash, and the gray-backed male stayed with him as a memory too private to become a debate. The braided loop remained in a wooden box beside Daniel's old phone. An animal expert once examined the fur and said its structure did not fully match black bear, but the sample was too contaminated to provide a reliable conclusion. Ethan accepted that more easily than he expected. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, Ethan drove back near Alder Creek, stopped in an approved area, and walked to the cedar beside Road 29. He fixed a small metal plate engraved with his brother's name to the trunk, then stood in light rain, remembering the promise that had brought him into the valley. Before leaving, Ethan used a branch to knock twice against the cedar. The forest stayed silent for almost a minute. He turned toward the car and had taken only a few steps when 2 deep knocks answered from the mountain slope. A third sound came from lower down, lighter and clumsier, like a young creature trying to imitate others. Ethan stopped, placed his hand on the wet bark, and answered with 2 slow beats. He did not follow the sound. Leaving while there was still daylight showed that he had finally understood something. Respect sometimes begins with knowing where to stop. That evening, Ethan checked the recorder still in his jacket pocket. Besides rain and 3 knocking sounds, it had captured a chain of small, rough syllables, almost like the way Daniel used to say his name. Ethan listened to it many times, but he never claimed the creature had spoken. He simply kept the recording with the braided loop, because the value of the experience was not in proving it to the world. Its value was in how it helped him live better. From that year onward, on every anniversary of Daniel's death, 3 branches appeared before the memorial plate, arranged in a straight line on the wet ground. There were never boot prints, tire marks, or any clear tracks to explain who had placed them there.